And then the king clearly had to back down on this. And the effect of this, even though it's a strange thing, you know, the effect of this was to let the nobles off the hook, but that was only the very, very first step of the story, because, of course, what it made people feel across the country, here is God's envoy on earth, the king, and we've made him. We, the humble people, have made the king back down and change his mind, which, of course, made people feel extraordinarily powerful. And all across the country from then on, there were riots across the land, and the peasants started burning down tax offices, so nobody therefore had any records of who was supposed to pay tax anywhere. So I like to think they did it with a little advert as well that said, make sure you burn down your tax office before January the 31st to avoid unnecessary payments. And this was when the pamphlets started coming out. There were 2,500 pamphlets came out in 1 month in Paris. Because for the first time, people are thinking, well, what we say makes a difference. We can have a debate about something and it matters, rather than it having no effect whatsoever. And the king had to employ another strategy. And so he called a parliament of sorts. He said, if you elect people, it was quite complicated, but one way or the other, he said, if you elect a group of people, they can advise me on how to deal with this crisis. And of course, people that were elected were then treated by contempt by the royal court, with utter contempt, until such point as they arrived one day at their offices and found it locked. It's been debated whether that was by accident or not, but they thought it wasn't by accident, so they went to the nearest place that they found open, which was a tennis court, and they pledged an oath that we will be the true parliament as elected representatives of the French people until such time as we are dispersed, they said. And the king said, well, you're going to be dispersed very quickly, and sent 20,000 troops to disperse them. And at this point, these elected representatives, who were mostly lawyers and fairly bourgeois figures, they then faced a choice. I mean, they clearly weren't going to take on the troops of the king on their own. They had to turn to the people of Paris and say, we call upon you to rise up in defence of your elected representatives against this unelected king. And this was when it all kicked off, if you like. This was when the whole thing started, and the great speeches were made. Camille Desmoulins, this sort of flamboyant figure, made this speech where he said, the great are only great because we are on our knees, let us rise. And the people in every area of France was organised into this army to try and defend the elected representatives. 48,000 people were called upon. They set up this thing called the Paris Commune, which is, you know, I know there was another one later on, but the Paris, not to get you confused with dates, but they had the job. They gave themselves the job of organising 48,000 people to defend the elected representatives, 800 from each district. Now, in the Simon Sharma book, it says this figure of 48,000 was easily reached. Now, anyone who has ever tried to organise 4 people to meet in the same bar at the same time for a game of pool knows you do not get 48,000 people to arm themselves against the king's troops easily. That is not easily done. It takes an immense amount of organisation and persuasion and discussion, and indeed there was one district that got 1,200 people and therefore surpassed their target, and well done them. There was another district that got 4. And I love the idea that the bloke in charge of that district, if it was a bloke, must have had to go down to the town hall and go, not 800, no, not 800, no. 4. But they're ever so keen. So this number of people did indeed meet up at one place, as I'm sure many of you will know, called the Bastille, which was this. Many reasons for this. I mean, there's a lot of the gunpowder of the city had been moved to the Bastille, so it was militarily important, if you like. But also, it was this huge, imposing stone monstrosity of a building that must have looked down on you from everywhere you went. You couldn't go out of the house without seeing this giant building looking down at you, imposing. We are the royal family, we are the system, and you will not be able to defy us. There's also a dungeon where people in the Bastille, where people could be jailed for the slightest little transgression against adhering to royal etiquette. Poets who'd written poems against the royal family were kept in there, for example. And so this was where the great battle was. And again, Of course it wasn't just simple. Of course it wasn't just a matter of people, they turned up there, stormed the Bastille. It was chaos. Some people were invited in to meet the governor, didn't know why, got there, what are we doing, sent out for reinforcements, came back out again, chaos. Half the day went by. There must have been quite a few people who just thought, oh, blimey, I knew nothing had happened, I'm going home. There must have been people who did that until eventually one lad who was brilliant at climbing clambered onto a perfume shop from where he managed to manoeuvre himself onto a chain that held the drawbridge together, and tools were passed up to him, and he was able to hack his way through this drawbridge, which collapsed, and then they ran out. They got some local carpenter to build a sort of quick bridge, which they got over, and then eventually they made their way into the Bastille after this enormous sort of debates and so on. And even then, when they got to the Bastille, they got the keys to the dungeon, but they then had to have another battle to get to the dungeon itself, at which point they realised that the bloke who'd got the keys had gone home. And must have been going, oh, blimey, I didn't realise it was going on this long, I've got to pick the kids up, and just go. He's just gone. So they battled their way in there, thinking they were about to release hundreds of political prisoners, but there was only 7 prisoners in there, one of which was convinced he was Julius Caesar. Which must be frustrating after a while. No. There would have been an 8th, incidentally, the Marquis de Sade, but he'd been transferred to another prison the week before for shouting obscenities at passers-by through a tube out of the window. So the thing was enveloped in this sort of wonderful chaos, if you like. But at the end of it, the king had to back down. He clearly wasn't going to get away with trying to destroy the elected representatives. And now a system was engineered whereby the king would rule alongside the parliament. The parliament could pass these. The king had a veto, a bit like your bloke. The king could do that. So it was a sort of, they both had power, but neither could sort of do anything without the other, if you like. And clearly this was going to lead to some sort of tension. Now, the important thing, though, as far as the mass of the population goes, was now people thought, millions of people, huge numbers of people realised what we say has a difference. The feudal laws were dismantled, all the pigeons and wine and hunting stuff, all of that sort of thing was dismantled. This had an immense impact in making people feel strong. What we say makes a difference. How different that is to society most of the time, when most political discussions take place around the idea that it's someone else that makes the difference. It's all about what should someone else do, what should Congress do, the senator do, what should the head of the television network do, important people. We sort of sit around and discuss that's most political discussions for most people. Not what should we do, what can we do to make an impact, because of course that's the way that people are brought up to think about this, about their role in society. And so this whole of society then completely transformed by this in this way. And this also, of course, is when the great characters of the French Revolution start to emerge, because they're the people who are able to stand up and win the votes and persuade people that their way of thinking is the one that people should follow. Danton, for example, this extraordinary, huge, gregarious figure who sort of, just everything about him was like some sort of modern drunk, I suppose. No, more than that. He did actually disappear when he was minister later on. He disappeared for 3 days, and when he arrived back, and they said, "Where have you been?" He just said, "Well, I was drunk." It's mad, isn't it? Incredible. Now, I don't know what it's like over here. No British politician would ever be in danger of being anywhere near that interesting. I can assure you of that. They often they get interviewed. Some of these new Labour characters, you probably won't know the names, thankfully, but they get interviewed and they sit there. The interviewer says, "Aha! But you're actually contradicting what your own minister said on the night of June." I think no, that's the wrong way to interview them. It'd be much better if they waited until they finished and then the presenter just went, "Oh, I'm sorry, I completely drifted off. I was miles away, mate. You don't have to carry on." But these extraordinary people who would make these impromptu speeches at which thousands of people would turn up. No microphones, no oi, louder, none of that. There's this extraordinary sort of system that they had to go by. And Danton was incredibly popular because he was able to speak the spirit of what people were thinking, if you like. And the amazing thing, almost as if Hollywood had dreamt this up, the other leader of the French Revolution the main sort of leader from this point on, was a character called Robespierre, who was completely the opposite. Robespierre had no friends, he had no sort of relationships, no sexual relationships with anyone, as far as anyone can work out. He didn't drink, he hardly ate anything, and he was aware that he had this image, and so, which came out in a letter that he wrote to a friend at one point. He said, "It is said that I am not capable of enjoying some of the finer things in life. But last weekend I visited the house of a friend in which there were a great many cakes. And one night I was tempted to try one." But the brilliant thing about these two, they got on incredibly well as the leaders, the two leaders of the radical faction of the revolution, to the point that it was tested, this friendship, in the most dramatic and unpleasant of ways, because Danton's wife died, and Robespierre sent him a letter in which he said, "If the certainty of having a tender and devoted friend could bring you any consolation, I offer that to you. From this time on, I am one with you. I love you more than ever, and will love you unto death." Which is so French, isn't it? You know, if he'd been English, he'd have just gone, "Yeah, hard luck, mate. Ever fancy a drink?" No. Not gay, you know what I mean? But these two were joined by another character who was a physician called Jean-Paul Marat, who became elected because he produced a paper in the most trying of circumstances called The Friend of the People. It was always being smashed up, and his printing press was destroyed, and he'd pop up in some other bit of Paris and start all over again. And Marat argued that the King's veto was going to prevent any sort of progress here, and that therefore the royal family should be, even he didn't say that they should be abolished at this point, but that the royal family should be kept much more in check. Now, Jean-Paul Marat has sort of been dealt with in extraordinary fashion in history, as becoming one of the most appalling people of all time, and you see all sorts of things. He joins Hitler and Stalin and all this sort of thing as the great evil people. He was extremely angry, there's no doubt about that. I mean, extraordinarily, unfeasibly angry. And there was, for example, The Friend of the People one week had a headline, "Mankind has the right to deal with their oppressors by devouring their palpitating hearts." Which, now, personally, I think a note should be taken of who clapped there. And they should not be given any position of authority at all. Call me soft. I wonder if there was an editorial meeting about this particular headline, you know, if someone went, "Oh, I don't know about that." If he said, "Well, if you're going to go soft on me, you can fuck off and join the Democrats."